Hi, I'm Bill Hodges, and this is Spotlight on Government. And I have today Candy Olson, Chairman of the Hillsborough School Board. I am so excited that you're here.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Education is the way out of Americans' problems today. I'm convinced of that. And I'd like to hear from you what Hillsborough County is doing in order to open that door.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's really the way up for kids, and we have to work with the community. There are issues that we can't solve, but what we are doing right now is we took a very hard look at, I just said we need help from the community, but the reality is we can't control the community. We can control what goes on within our walls. And what we know is the thing that we have the most influence over, that has the most influence over children, is great teachers. So one of our initiatives is, people call it the Gates Grant. We're trying to get away from the title. We're calling it Empowering Effective Teachers. But Bill and Melinda Gates gave us a large grant over 7 years to build a really good data system so that anybody can say, here's what's happening in this classroom, here are the children who aren't getting it, here's maybe where they're weak. Use that to evaluate teachers and then support them to get better. It's been hard to do because we want to evaluate every teacher fairly, and that means measuring every child's growth with that teacher. We have an advantage in this county. I know a lot of our teachers don't feel like it's an advantage to be under this spotlight, but within the rest of the state, the legislature last year required that teachers be evaluated 50% on test scores and 50% on other. And many school districts are having to use the school-wide reading score as the 50% growth for students in the evaluation, which to me is not particularly fair to the guidance counselor, the principal, the math teacher, but that's
true.
You know, they've rushed into it and that's what they have to do. We are looking at every single group, guidance counselors, media specialists, as well as our traditional in the classroom teachers, and saying, how do we measure your impact on children? And that test score, that data is 40%, and then 30% comes from the principal, and 30% comes from another teacher who's considered a peer evaluator. The other thing we're doing that may be even more exciting is that for new teachers, we're providing a mentor who will be in your classroom on a regular basis, helping you transfer what you learned in school or in another district to directly impact the children in this district. So that if you're having trouble with 12 kids learning fractions and the other 12 kids are doing fine, we're going to help you figure out how to do a little something different to get those other kids up to speed. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not the solution. Lots of times people talk about education as the solution, and I hear businesses say, well, we can't hire people who are trained to do what we want. If you look at how quickly the world is moving, how quickly the world is changing, I'm not sure you can expect a school system to train people on the iPad or whatever is coming next week. But we can build some thinking skills and some approaches and hopefully really help people be successful. On the other side, maybe business needs to look at how they're hiring. Maybe the way that worked 20 years ago needs to be fine-tuned in this day and age. I don't think you can put it on all on schools.
You're definitely right. And it's interesting when you talk about what business needs. I taught up at Edison College in Ohio, and we did a survey of all the employers in that whole area. Asked them, what is the #1 need you have for us to do? And they said, have the employee show up on time.
And how do we teach that?
Well,
you know,
one of the things they did was, instead of letting students cut all the classes they wanted to, they said, okay, you need to make the class, you need to be there on time. Counts against your grade if you're not.
And we have done that, and it's interesting because students say, well, you don't understand, the school's too big for me to get from here to there. And what we routinely say back, we just had the student forum, and this came up, and several of us said, when you go to work, your employer doesn't care if there was a traffic jam.
Right.
Your employer wants you ready to work once work starts. But that is a hard thing to teach some kids.
If you're a nurse and you were in the ICU and you didn't show up on time and all of the bells and whistles went off and somebody died, they don't care if it's a traffic accident. You got to plan it in, right?
But you know, other countries have the same problem. I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal. In India, the call centers are having trouble finding graduates of their schools who speak English well enough and have the needed skills. So I think it's a challenge anywhere. And when we in this country say we want every student to graduate from high school, the reality is some of them are not going to understand about showing up from work on time, being dressed appropriately. We can do some of that, but we have to realize we're trying to do this with every single child. No other country even tries that.
You just hit on one of my hot buttons, is being dressed appropriately. I went into a high school not long ago, and I won't say where, but the teachers were dressed worse than the students were. I believe in a dress code for at least the people working there.
Well, I think that everybody ought to dress appropriately. And I know that in some schools, they collect teachers' ugly T-shirts, and when the kids violate the dress code, they have to wear one of the ugly T-shirts. They don't get as many dress code violations. But I want to circle back and just say, I think it's important to remember this country is trying to educate every single child. There's no other country in the world that even talks about that. So when we say we aren't graduating enough kids, I agree with you. But nobody else is even trying to do what we're doing. That's typically American, but it's an important thing to remember.
It is an important factor, but let's go back to evaluations. Now, in my training company, we teach about 360 evaluations, and I really believe in the 360 process. One-way evaluations really are very ineffective. Do you use a 360 there? Does the teacher get to evaluate the people above them also?
Yes. We're just developing that part of the evaluation, and we've had for the moment, we're not doing a 360 on teachers. There's some concern, and I think it's legitimate. If you ask parents and students to evaluate a teacher, first of all, how do you do that with very young children? And secondly, how do you make sure that you don't have charges of, well, the teacher's just doing that to get everybody to give them a good evaluation? So for the moment...
They still have to get results.
Well, for the moment, we don't have that piece in there because we haven't figured out how to do it. But certainly input from a wide variety of sources is important, whether it's the traditional 360 or something different. There has to be a variety of pieces.
I would be willing to bet that in any high school that you go into, if you had the teachers all write down on a slip of paper, who is the worst teacher in this school, that you'd have a consistency of who that worst teacher is. They know who those people are.
That might be.
And we need to get those people out or give them help, one of the two.
And that's the whole point of this system. This says, here's where you need to improve if you do. And if you don't, then we've documented your test scores aren't working, the principal doesn't think it's working, the peer doesn't think it's working, we've given you help. I will say in this district, we do fire teachers. We have for a long time. Probably the least favorite thing that I do as a school board member. Other districts haven't done that. We've worked with our union to make sure we can do that because, frankly, the teachers don't want those weak teachers around either.
It drags them all down.
It does.
I don't like firing. I'm not like certain people. I don't enjoy firing.
Right.
I don't like firing. When I have somebody on staff and I put a lot of time into that person, if I can bring them up to par, is a lot better than going out and hire the devil I don't know and bringing them in. And when we teach supervision classes all the time, we tell the supervisor, don't use your evaluations as a club. Use them as a way to lift people up. And I think that's what you're trying to say. Is that what you're doing?
That's exactly what we're doing. We're supporting teachers, and the clearest example of that is with our new teacher mentoring. We had a much lower turnover. Far fewer teachers left last year than usually leave. I think you throw a teacher into the classroom and say good luck, that some of them are going to go, I can't do this. But when they have a coach to help them where they run into a rough spot, it does work.
You mentioned India a couple of times. And India is near and dear to my heart because it's one of my favorite countries. And I just was over there for 3 weeks. Had an opportunity to meet a lot of people, see a lot of things. And I don't know, my Facebook, I've probably got 400 or 500 Indians from around the world on it. And I say around the world because they're literally all over. But they've done some interesting things with this new technology where they're putting out the cheap tablets and doing away with books. Now, granted, the first bunch that came out weren't really good, but they were only 50 cents or $50 a piece, $30 actually, at the time when they first came out with it. Are we doing anything here similar to that to replace books and put out tablets?
We are, and we've had a couple of interesting reactions. Part of the problem is getting the publishers to let us have the content. And so we've been working with various producers of the iBooks to make sure that whatever we do will work for the students. We've also had some kids say that doesn't help me. So we have to remember that this will be great for many students, particularly kids who have trouble reading, and we have some piloting right now, and they love the fact that if they're in the middle of a book and they don't understand the word, all they have to do is push the word on the screen and the dictionary definition comes up. Or a demonstration of a lab experiment comes up. And that's wonderful for many of the kids. The publishers have been reluctant. They're now coming on board, I think because Apple came out with the new program. We'll see this coming more, but we do have several schools doing it, and they're finding it very helpful for most kids, not all.
I'm a high right brain, and I just love technology. I love being able to push a button and see something happen and have it described to me as a video. And with central cities having more and more right-brain students, I think our traditional left-brain system has to move in that direction if we're going to reach those kids at all.
Well, what we really have to do is I heard a guy named Bill Daggett who talks about, I'm a friend of education, but let me tell you what's wrong with it. And one of the things he says is we've organized learning to be convenient for teachers. If we really want rigor, it has to be relevant to the kids.
Oh, I agree with
drives
that,
the rigor.
totally.
Relevance engages the kid in doing the hard work of learning the hard stuff. And that's what we're doing. Now, a lot of our teachers do that. We have a lot of what we call professional learning communities where teachers sit down and try and develop lessons that are more interesting, more rigorous. And in 2 years, 46 states will have the Common Core standards, which necessitate that kind of learning because they're much more in-depth, much less superficial. And a lot of what we've been doing in the last few years has been preparing for that. Some teachers like it, some don't. Some kids think it's dumb. But I can be in one class one day and have the kids say, why do we have to do this? And be in a class the next day and say, why can't we have more of that? So it's all about finding what works for every student.
Well, you know, I think back across my life, and it was teachers that made the difference. And it wasn't teachers that particularly went by the book.
No.
Most of the teachers that Burt Rankin, it goes back, and this man was absolutely phenomenal. I went to 9 schools in 2 different countries before I got to his class in the 10th grade. And this guy, wherever I'd went before, they taught English, but not this part of English. And when I got to the next school, they'd already taught whatever I got, but they hadn't taught that. And so I had some real gaps. And in writing, this man, when I wrote my first paper, he said to me, I read it 3 times before I finally got around to grading it because it was that good. He said, but have you ever had a class in grammar? But he didn't dwell on the fact that my grammar was bad. He said, we're going to work on it.
Right.
But don't quit writing.
And that's what good teachers do. They help bring up, they take the strengths and use them to build the weaknesses.
What are some of the ways that you think the public can help? You know, if my kid screwed up at school, when he came home, he got it from me too. But I'm finding a lot of people say, oh, it's the school's problem. They need to do this. What can we do as grandparents, parents, and just interested citizens to give your school better support?
I think one of the most important things is don't assume it's the school's problem. You know, I just said businesses have said we can't hire the right people. My question is, are you sure that the hiring process you have gets you the right kind of people? Understand that what we're doing is very ambitious and that there is no silver bullet. Evaluating teachers is a very important point. It's hugely impactful for our kids. It doesn't fix everything. The other side of this, I think, is funding. Everybody is having to cut. We understand that. When USF was on the chopping block, I could honestly say, I feel your pain. We've been there. Our district has cut $140 million over the past 4 or 5 years.
$140 million? What's the size of your budget?
Well, it's in the billions. It's close to $2 billion. But those are people and service, because we have 190,000 students. So yes, it's a lot of money, but it's serving all those kids and the teachers and the school buses and all of those services. And someone once said to me, well, I don't understand why you're so upset. I mean, when I went to school, we had a principal, and the principal had a secretary, and then we had the teacher. Kids who have parents who support education, who get them in trouble when they got in trouble at school, don't need a lot of support. But if we are going to reach every child, even those whose parents are illiterate or not home, we have to have an array of supports, and those cost money. So we've cut our budget. Maybe another way to say it is we are, in per student terms, at about the level we were in 2003, 2004. So we've cut back on a lot of things, some of which we frankly didn't need to do. Every business can jettison some stuff that used to be important. But eventually we're going to have to look at whether we want to spend the money to really effectively teach the kids. You talked about iBooks. They cost money. Certainly they are very valuable. Textbooks cost money too. But all of those things require money, and that is a piece of the puzzle as well. But I think the biggest thing is no silver bullet. Let's find mutual solutions, and then let's look at putting enough money in to do the job.
I guess I'm one of those people that says I can always throw money at it. It doesn't necessarily make it better.
You're absolutely right. If you get sick and the doctor gives you the wrong medicine, it doesn't help. If you get sick and the doctor gives you 10 days of antibiotics and you only buy 5 days worth, that doesn't help either. It needs to be precise, it needs to be targeted, but the resources that are necessary need to be there.
Well, I like that old saying, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance.
Yes.
And we just can't afford to slip.
No, we can't.
If we're not going to have factory jobs,
Right.
if we're not going to have people going into the mills and doing those kind of work, we have to then educate enough people to be able to do the high-tech jobs that we need to be able to bring back here.
We do, but let's not forget the plumbers, the electricians, those jobs don't get outsourced. They may not require Algebra 2 and high-level reading, but you can make a very nice living doing that.
I love your career center down in Ruskin. I've
yes.
had them on the show, and I've been down there and seen it. And really, folks, if you've not seen some of the things like the career centers, I mean, don't go down there en masse, but down there especially, they have a culinary organization that they're training kids to be chefs and waiters and various things. You can each, I assume they still have the program where you can go down there as a group.
Yes.
And get a meal. If you're thinking of an outing that is going to be opening your eyes, do that, because I think it's a fabulous thing to do.
It is, and those career centers are reaching kids who had given up on school in the traditional schools. But those kids will make good livings. They will contribute to society. Again, it's not one size fits all.
Sonny told me down there when he was principal, he said that he had students that absolutely hated school. They hated it. Walked in backwards so they didn't have to see the building till they got there. Who, when they went there, started failing classes so they wouldn't have to graduate.
And they turned them all around, didn't they?
Right. They loved the place so much they were actually failing classes. You'd have to call them in and say, look, you can't fail this class. You're smart enough. I know you can do it. And
Yeah,
that's the kind of joy should be in education.
Absolutely. And I've had kids, and I got a little suspicious because I heard it so often. When I asked kids at the career centers, how do you like it? Almost to a student, they said, I love it here. They really care about me and I can do the work. I used to hate school. My mother used to have to yell at me to come to school. We need to do more of that, but we also need to do more of the traditional preparing kids to go to college and be successful. And we don't know what the jobs are going to be like. So we have to prepare them to think, to find resources, to evaluate, to be critical of the information they get.
Well, when John was principal down there, every student that came there sat across from him.
Yep.
He would bring them in, a 10-minute, 15-minute, whatever was required to let them know what he expected of them and what they could do for them.
Yep.
And I just was absolutely enthralled with the way this operation works. Tell me about some of the other career centers. Can we take a second? I know that one down there.
Well, they're all similar in that they take kids who are not troublemakers, just struggling,
Right.
and give them jobs where they can learn the skills they need, but also the academics they need in a more concrete way, perhaps, more hands-on. You can do algebra on paper and pencil in the chalkboard, or you can do algebra by figuring out how many square yards of sod you need. For these kids, the latter is better. So giving them ways to learn that give them success is really important. We have a lot of technical and vocational programs in our schools as well. You don't have to go to a career center. And some kids take these programs saying, I want to be a welder, or I want to own a restaurant. And some take them saying, I don't really know what I want to do, so maybe if I try this, it'll give me a clue.
Does anybody, when they're 17, know what they want to do?
Absolutely know.
I had no idea at 17. You know, they were pushing me to be a dentist.
It would be like pulling teeth, right?
Yeah, and I got into that first class in college of chemistry, and I'll never forget her. We called her Bloody Mary Beloyan. She was as wide as she was tall. She stood down on the floor, and she said, how many of you people play football? And I raised my hand along with others. She said, you won't pass my class. You might as well get out today.
Oh, my gosh.
That was my dental career. It was all over.
We hope teachers don't do that in public schools, but...
I don't know. She did me a favor. Gave me a reason not to be there.
But kids, part of the reason kids don't pay attention in schools, they don't see any relevance. They don't see any reason. They're just, I'm suffering through this. Just let me get over it and go home. And so we have to give them a reason to be in school, to be engaged. And
I think so.
for some kids, that's a career. And sometimes these kids take part of a technical program and say, oh, never again. But it's a really valuable way for...
Now, do all these centers have different kinds of programs? Like, I know they have the culinary program down there. They have the auto shop, the small motors. They have a brick and mortar.
They really vary depending on
Are there different ones if I wanted to go to technical and learn to do a different thing?
Yes, they vary depending on what the community businesses have said they need.
Oh.
And what the students in the community have said they're interested in. So we try and find a match.
Okay.
So you'll find a lot of commonality, but you'll find some differences as well.
Other things, I mean, that was something we hadn't even thought about talking about on the show. But what other things are there buried there that maybe the average person doesn't know is going on within the Hillsborough school system?
Maybe the most important thing is how different teaching has become. As I've said, we don't know what your career is going to be. All we can do is teach you how to think and how to get information. That's not the same thing as handing a kid a textbook, collecting the book, handing a test, grading the test. This is engaging young minds in exploration and critical thinking, and a lot of people think that's just so much hooey. But the reality is, someone who graduates from school today will probably have 6 different careers. That's according to the U.S. Department of Labor.
Wouldn't doubt it at all.
And they are, you know, their job is to figure out what the labor force should look like. 6 different careers, not 6 different jobs, not 6 different companies, maybe 6 different kinds of things. So our kids need to have some basic math and science. They certainly need the social studies, the geography, the history. And I think they need to hear those things from teachers who have the ability to say, this is not all black and white. This is not all simple. A lot of people don't like to hear that. They want to hear, you know, the Americans are good, certain terrorist countries are bad. The gray doesn't come in. And those teachers bring that into the classroom. It takes a certain amount of courage. They bring in guest speakers, and sometimes they get criticized for that.
Yeah, that was my...
I know that's where you were going.
Yeah, well, I wanted to touch on that. During the Korean War, brainwashing was a big thing. The North Koreans brainwashed a lot of our troops. And our military found out the reason that our troops could be brainwashed is we've done such a poor job of sharing what the rest of the world is all about. We have our own little knowledge. So that when the North Koreans were able to tell our troops certain things, they weren't able to say, that's a lie, that's wrong. They weren't ever given the opportunity to think about different things. And I noticed recently that there was a Muslim speaker who came into the schools and shared a little bit about the Muslim religion. And it would seem to me this is a great opportunity for the kids to come home and say, I had a speaker on this, and they said this to their parents or their pastors. But all I saw was a group of people being threatened.
Yeah, and it's
I
unfortunate.
think more of this should happen so the kids do have a chance to ask early rather than being later.
As a mother, I always wanted my kids to learn it in school and then come home and say, Mom, and then we could have our discussion. And I think, nobody disagrees with there are terrorists out there who wish us ill.
Sure.
The argument here is over the best way to deal with that threat. And the best way for me, in large part, is when you're studying world history as a high school student, let's bring in a Muslim, a Christian, a Hindu, a Jew. And that's what these teachers do. Buddhist,
Yeah.
a Buddhist, thank you, yes. And these are religions that are required to be taught by the state, which I think makes great good sense. Our kids need to know, particularly with globalization, how many other different worldviews there are. That doesn't mean this worldview is right, this one's wrong. It means they're out there, you better be aware of it.
Then the kid can go home and talk to his parents, his pastor, and say, this is the way it was. This is what I heard. Is this true?
Right. And I think the important thing to remember is the teacher's in the classroom, and if a speaker gets off track, the teacher brings the topic back on track. But I think it's better to teach those things with some combination of a textbook and lecture and speaker than to just say memorize these facts. I don't know about you. I memorized a lot of facts, forgot them the day after the test. This is not what I want my kids to know and be able to
I want
do.
them to be able to think.
Exactly.
When they come out of school, the biggest thing about school, even college, isn't so much the knowledge you gain, but the ability to think through things. And that is extremely important.
You're absolutely right, but they need some basic knowledge.
Oh, that's
I mean,
true.
you can't think through, does it make sense that there's a glacier in the Sahara Desert, unless you have some basic knowledge about what a desert is, where the Sahara is, what a glacier is. But then you need to build on that and to have some critical thinking skills.
And that's the important thing to me, is just to be able to come out of there thinking. And as you point out, they have to have basic knowledge. They're going to get that, but not by rote, not just repeating it back, but because it makes sense.
They don't get it by rote.
That's right.
We know that. I mean, how many generations have gone through school memorizing and forgetting?
Well, memorizing and forgetting, Candy, we've come to the end of our 30 minutes, and I've truly appreciated you being on here. Candy Olson, Chairman of the Hillsborough School Board, 8th largest district, or is it 7th?
Eighth largest in the country.
8th largest in the country. That's a pretty good size.
It's big.
Thank you for being with me, and I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
I'm Bill Hodges. This is Spotlight on Government. You're unique, you're special. Tell yourself so often, because you are, you know. And we'll see you on the next Spotlight on Government. Again, Candy Olson, thank you for being with me. 17 years on the school board, and I wish you well.
Thank you.